Thank you for joining the Resilient Cyber Show. My name is Chris Hughes, along with my co-host, Dr. Nikki Robinson.
Hey, everybody.
And today we have a unique situation because our guest is actually Dr. Nikki. So we're going to be chatting with Dr. Nikki Robinson on her new book. It's called Mind the Tech Gap, Addressing the Conflicts Between IT and Security Teams. So I guess before we dive in, maybe some folks aren't familiar with you. So a bit about your background, and then we'll dive into the book from there.
Yeah, sounds good. So I was in IT operations. That's really where I got my start. So I started as on help desk, probably like your traditional like help desk to security story, but started on help desk, worked my way up to sort of a senior sysadmin, did a lot of Windows systems administration and leading a team. So I did a lot of IT operations type work. I think I was 24/7 on call for like 11 years. And then, sort of got really interested in cybersecurity, especially from the vulnerability management angle. So I started working on certifications and working my way into cybersecurity. And anyway, so I've been in security for about 4 years, doing everything from vulnerability management to incident response, security architecture and design. So that sort of led me to where I am today. And part of the inspiration or being interested in writing a book was, when I decided to make that transition into security, I was working on a DSC in cybersecurity and exploring vulnerability management. And from that angle, I very much was like, oh, I really want to write. And so getting to write a doctorate and a dissertation was sort of this like precursor to wanting to write the book.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll dive into this a little bit here, but it's ironic that you mentioned getting started on the help desk. That's actually how I started out in the military and IT before cyber. And honestly, it's like, you ever heard people say like, you should work in the service industry? I think that, in IT, you should work on the help desk, because I learned a hell of a lot about communication and troubleshooting and working with people and all those kind of things due to being on the help desk early on in my career. So I want to ask you, on the book topic, I know you had writing aspirations due to your academic, pursuits and things like that, but why this topic? What made you settle on this topic?
It was funny. It was right before I made the transition from IT to cybersecurity. I started seeing, I started getting more involved in security assessments and in audits and being a system owner, someone who actually owns a group of systems. I started interacting a lot more with security and not just on incidents or vulnerabilities, things like that, but really these big, heavy meetings and long form projects when it came to working with security. And I started seeing this sort of combative nature between IT and security. It was like, I'm on this side, you're on this side. Sorry, my puppy is literally knocking everything over in the background. So if you hear background noise. Anyway, so I started seeing this very like, well, I'm on the IT side and I do this and I do that. And, I'm on the security side and you have to do this and you have to do that. And it became this very combative thing. And so I really wanted to dig in and understand, like, why are we fighting with each other? We both may want different things, but at the end of the day, if we work better together, we're actually going to end up getting a lot of these problems solved. And so it doesn't have to be this, this fight. We can actually work together. And so that was really the inspiration behind the book. And then moving into security, working with IT and developers and application owners, product owners, and seeing how, me understanding how difficult it is to try to get these projects done, IT projects, trying to get these applications online and in production. And, from the security side, it's like, but wait, we also want you to do these 100 things, because if you don't, you're putting an insecure product out there. And so seeing it from both sides, I really felt like there needed to be something to describe why these conflicts exist and why there's, can be frustration between teams. So that really helped me sort of pull together the idea for the book.
Yeah, I think anyone that's been in security for some time now has definitely, run into that situation and can relate to the kind of the conflict and tension between IT operations and security. At a high level, both groups are ultimately supporting the goals of the business or the organization or the mission. But at a lower level, they have very different tasks and different focus areas. Why do you think those groups have historically been at odds? What do you think has contributed to that?
Yeah, so I think a few things, and I do touch a little bit on it in the book, but this idea that is sort of from a job description and job role form, we we really have a completely different goals. On the IT side, on the operations and development side, we're there to support a product. We're there to support a customer. And that means that we probably have SLAs. We have to keep, we might have 99% uptime is our requirement, or, we need to make sure this functionality is available for our customer. And on the security side, our job is to reduce risk, where in whatever format that might be, remediating vulnerabilities, providing secure configuration guidance, dealing with audits and assessments. But our job is to help lower risk or help determine risk and then come up with a plan from there. And so I think those are often very competing goals, because when you want to enhance or improve security, sometimes that impacts functionality. And I think especially from like a historical view, anyone that's been in IT and security for some time has probably had at least one bad experience where they've applied a patch or they've put in a secure configuration and it's broken everything. I think we saw that in the news a couple of days ago, that changing one thing can sometimes break a ton of systems. And so I think that's partially where some of this conflict comes from, is this hey, I know if I make this change, it could impact my users and it could be my job on the line. It could be something as serious as my job is on the line if these systems go down, which, is obviously very concerning. And that's where I think some of that pushback comes from. But I also think from an education and certification standpoint, we have very different tracks. In IT, we focus very heavily on the technology and how does the technology work? How do we make it work? How do we use it? How do we build things? And from a security education standpoint, it's what are the threat vectors? Where are attackers coming in? What do vulnerabilities mean? How do I remediate them? How do I build systems securely by design? And those end up being, not just competing goals, but they can end up making projects take longer. If you're trying to enhance or improve security in a product, which then again might affect the customer. If a customer is expecting a product by Friday and you're like, well, we got to push it out a week because we have to do some more testing, then it's like, oh, are we affecting our customer experience? And so I think it really sort of snowballs, but it really starts with education, certifications, and our mission, sort of what we're told from day one. If you're told from day one, keep these systems up 99% of the time, that's your only job. Just keep them up 99% of the time. If things start encroaching in it, like security controls or having to take time to apply patches, things like that, then it starts to become this sort of I don't know if I want to do that. And that's what sort of snowballs into friction.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. And, it's kind of a combination of institutionalization, I guess you'd say, from the time we come in the career field and the way we think about what we do and why we do it. And then also just different incentives of how we're judged and how we advance our career and what we're gauged on from a performance perspective. And honestly, I see a lot of parallels here when you think about development and security too. They're trying to get new features out, to new applications to production and so on. And then here comes security, adding friction, slowing them down, causing frustration. So I wanted to ask, given those parallels, if you look at the push for DevOps and now DevSecOps, do you feel like there's any headway being made in terms of breaking down silos and bringing those teams together, that kind of thing?
So I'm going to say yes and no, because so yes, in some ways, right? Because you're sort of taking development teams and the intention is for them to work with the operations group or in DevSecOps to have security be involved from day one, especially even in the design meetings. Hey, this is how we want to develop this product or this application. What do you all think about that? So I would say yes, from that perspective, having everyone in the room up front can only help improve relationships, which then improves you sort of understand, okay, these people aren't here to make my job difficult, or they're not trying to slow me down. They really want to help me do this ahead of time so that I don't get slowed down at the end. So I think that can go a long way towards relationship building. But what I would say on the other side of it is when smaller to medium-sized businesses are trying to build a DevOps program, I've seen in some cases where it's like, okay, we've got one or two people that are doing DevOps and that's it. So it's not this big team of people that are working together. And so it's like they're already trying to do development and operations, and now we're trying to include security, and they're like, oh my gosh, why are you putting this additional strain on us? And so I think it can be a really great thing for bigger teams. I think that's super helpful to have everybody involved and to know who each other are, because I think that's part of the other problem is, if you have this operations group on the other side of the wall that you never see and never interact with, it's difficult to put a face to, oh, I'm working with this person. Oh, I know this person. Oh, okay. Yeah, we can work together. So I think the concept of it is really great. And I think I've seen it in practice. It works really great too. But I think for bigger teams, if you have a smaller team and you've got one person doing DevSecOps, that's where it becomes an issue. But yeah, for bigger teams, I like the idea of bringing everyone into a room from day one, because they get to see each other, they get to talk to each other, and get to know each other over the course of the project, not introduce them when you're trying to go to production on a Friday and Thursday you're like, oh, hey, by the way, here's the security team. They're going to do a review and you may or may not pass. So yes.
Yeah, I think I actually like the call out you made about DevSecOps is, initially it was kind of marketed as breaking down the silos between the teams and bringing all these teams together. But now you literally have people whose title is, DevSecOps engineer. So it's just been rolled into a single person essentially, or a single, type of, role, for example. One thing I want to touch on too is you talk in your book about emotional intelligence and things like that, communication. Us in tech, some people are very introverted. Those kind of topics are not something that they want to get too deep on. They don't really, they like working with themselves and working with technology and maybe not necessarily interfacing with a lot of people. That said, we actually have a guest coming up that's going to talk about the soft skills in cybersecurity. So I was curious, how important are those soft skills, things such as emotional intelligence, interacting, communication, those kind of things when it comes to making headway between IT operations and security?
Yeah, this is a great question, because I feel like it's an incredibly important topic, and mostly from a really just sort of understanding what those concepts mean in practice. So not just, emotional intelligence is this, how do you talk to people? How do you understand people? How do you empathy? How do you understand how people feel in a situation? But really in practice. And in practice, that means, how do I communicate via email with this person if I am feeling frustrated, or if my perception is that they're trying to, put all of these security controls on this product and I don't know how, and I'm frustrated. How do you articulate that, hey, you know what? I'm not sure if this is going to work this way. Can we work together and figure out if there's another solution for this? Or, hey, we can't apply this right now. What can we do in the meantime to help get us to a secure place until we can do X? And so I think it's about that understanding from both sides. From IT and security teams when they're working together, to sort of say, okay, I understand we have different goals. You might have a deadline. How can I either help you meet that deadline, or let's figure out a way that we can come up with some creative solution, so that way we're still putting security controls in place and protecting you from X, Y, and Z, but we're also making sure that we're, we talk a lot about business enablement and things like that, but it's also, how can I help make sure your job isn't super stressful? And I think that's part of what emotional intelligence is understanding that, sending a 300-page vulnerability report to an IT operations engineer might be really stressful. I bring up a sort of a scenario in the book where, let's say a security assessor or an ISO or something sends a vulnerability report with 300 vulnerabilities in it at 5:00 on Friday. That is rough. That's rough for anyone on the IT side, because they get this email maybe before they're getting ready to head home and have their weekend, and it's stressful. It's like, oh my gosh, I've got all these things I've got to take a look at. I don't know how to sort and prioritize these. How do I handle this? And that can fracture that relationship really quickly, versus maybe 9 a.m. on Monday morning saying, hey, I have this report. Do you have some time today? We can talk about it. I don't want to stress you out and send you 300 things and then just leave you to it. But hey, we can work on this together. And so I think emotional intelligence from that context is more about, how do you build relationships with people that actually positively impacts and lowers risk. So everything from sending an email to scheduling a meeting to not scheduling a meeting. So it's sort of understanding how people are and how they actually feel in a situation, versus, hey, why didn't they do X by this time when I thought that they would?
Yeah, I love where you were going with that, because you're kind of, humanizing it in the sense that you're thinking about the other person, what they may have going on, context of when you're sending the message, how you're sending the message, what time of the week it is, how you're communicating that information is so critical to consider, because it can have a pretty, mega impact in terms of like how it gets across to the other party and how they collaborate with you. You also talked about, business enablement there. In the book, you have another section that talks about, functionality and security. And, anyone who's been in security for some time has heard the phrase, if you want to make it secure, unplug it or throw it in a lake, or, crazy things like that. But we all know that doesn't enable the business. So I'm curious your take on functionality and security and how those, two interplay together.
Yeah, I was actually having this conversation with someone yesterday. We were talking about how do you communicate from the security side? How do you communicate with your IT counterparts or your development counterparts about why what you're doing is important? And to me, that bridge of that gap is availability. In the CIA triad in security, you have confidentiality, integrity, availability. Availability pairs really nicely with functionality, which is, I do want these systems to be online and available, because if they're down, that's also a problem for me, because I want to know why they're down. Is it a DDoS attack? What's happening that's taking these systems down? So I find that availability is a really nice bridge to sort of start that conversation of, hey, we do need to have security in place. We've got to have these things, to help protect your systems, because we want them to stay online. We want the business to continue. And if the systems go down because of ransomware or a DDoS attack, the business isn't going to be supported either. And so I think when you're talking about contextualizing and functionality, it's really about availability. I want these systems to be online. I want customers to be able to access them, but I want them to be able to access them in a way that protects them and protects us as the business. Because ransomware is a great example for really impacting the bottom line. And that has to do with functionality. If I can't get into my systems because they're all locked, I'm sort of dead in the water there. I'm not making money, probably losing money, and it might affect our reputation. So availability is a great place to start that conversation.
Yeah, I also wanted to ask you, you have another section that talks about building trust and relationships. And, given that, we're a security show, if we're talking to the security audience, what are some methods or recommendations about going about building trust and building relationships with your counterparts on the operations side?
Yeah. So I think my first piece of advice, because this was something, something I actually took from help desk. When you work on help desk, there are, more often than not, I had a lot of people call and yell at me for things, right? They were unhappy about something. And usually it wasn't even that, let's say the printer was offline or they couldn't access email or something like that. And they would be incredibly frustrated. Chances are that person wasn't that upset about the printer or that upset about not being able to access email, but they were frustrated and needed a place to vent and take their frustration out. And so not taking that personally, understanding that, this person is probably frustrated for a number of other reasons. If I can help them solve their problem in some sort of timely manner, or at least help them understand that, hey, we have a situation going on, we have an outage, we're working on it, here's your ETA, I'll keep you updated. Usually that conversation changes. It becomes a lot more, oh, okay, all right, you're not being combative with me. You understand that I'm frustrated. Okay. So I've taken that sort of attitude with me through security, which is most often when I've worked with someone for the first time, someone in IT or a developer, or a business or product owner, someone working with someone, sometimes they can be defensive right off the bat, very much, I can't do this. I've got these requirements. You don't understand. And so if I can come to that conversation and say, okay, tell me what I need to know. What kind of requirements do we have in place? What kind of SLAs do you have? What kind of timelines do you have? Is this the end of the quarter? Is that a big deal for you? So sort of asking them those questions up front lets them know that I'm not here to make their lives miserable, hopefully. But it really changes the conversation from, well, you didn't do this and you didn't do that, to, okay, let's figure out what happened. What happened? Was there some deadline you had to meet? Did you have to, we have to make some changes. I know that that's going to be tough on the staff. How can we make these changes a little easier so that way not everyone is frustrated? So I think that's probably my first tip, is to try to come into those conversations and understand that it's probably not your fault. It's probably nothing that you did. It's just maybe they've had bad experiences in the past. And so you have to sort of come in and change their mind about what I'm there to do, which is to improve security, but also, help support them in whatever project or goals that they're working in. And I would say the second is that having an understanding of how development works is a really important skill to have in security, because if you don't understand, application development in some capacity, you don't have to be a developer, but at least understanding some of their requirements or how they work together, that could be a really big benefit in helping you speak that language, helping you talk to them instead of saying, well, this vulnerability, this CVE ID came out today, and this is highly exploitable and this and that. And that's all important information, but give it to them in a context they understand and something they can action on too. Because if you just give them information, they're like, what do I do with this? So help them figure out how to do things. And by that, I mean, give them scripts to apply the settings, give them a script for detection. If you've got something like Log4j or something big going on that you need action on, don't just tell them to look for it. Give them a script and say, hey, here's how you can find out if this is in your environment. Can you report back and let me know if you have it? And then I can help you fix it. So it becomes let's work together instead of lobbing it over the fence and saying like, oh, just figure it out. Just fix it.
Yeah, I think that you pointed out so many great topics in that response right there. One is emotional intelligence, is where you emphasize again, is just understanding, hey, maybe it's not personal, maybe it's not about me. They're having a bad day, they're under a stressful deadline. Stepping back and detaching and actually thinking about it from that perspective and not taking it personal takes a lot of emotional maturity. And then also, contextualizing it, putting it in a way that they can understand it. It's applicable to their role and their function within the organization, and not just kind of rambling off CVSS, critical, all these things that they may not know what the hell that means. So you got to try to explain it to them in a term that they can make sense of. So some great points on that front. One other thing I wanted to ask you, as we move forward in this, trying to bridge the divide between operations and security and development and security, what do you see as some of the biggest gaps that remain? Is it a technology issue? Is it a personality, kind of people problem? What do you think some of the biggest gaps remaining are?
I would say the biggest gap I see right now is perception. I think perception is a really big barrier, and it's something that isn't studied a lot, especially in a technical context, because of exactly what you're saying, that we're technical people. We focus on technical solutions. We want to understand technology. We want to understand the tools, how they work together, how they integrate. And technology is changing so quickly that we focus a lot on that. How do we move to a containered environment? How do we move to a serverless infrastructure? How do we move to infrastructure as code? All these questions that come up, and we don't think about, well, how does this team perceive me? How do I perceive another team? Perception has a lot to do with, unconscious bias and how we interact with each other. And I would say that that's one of those things that really in the last 2 years I've spent a lot of time looking into, because without an understanding of how we work together and how we see each other, it can be really difficult to make progress. Teams that have been fighting for 10 years, the perception might be, well, this team did this or this team did this 5 years ago in this thing. And it's sort of like, okay, is it still relevant today? Are you still frustrated about it? Can we figure some way to move past this? So I think perception can be one of those really long lasting kind of detriments to working in the technology field. And I think, just as you mentioned early on, which is that, we don't talk a lot about emotional intelligence and empathy in the technical field, and that's okay. But I think perception is another one of those big things that we don't talk enough about how perception affects our teams and how we work together. Because it's the same thing, right? How people perceive management, and maybe how management perceives their technical staff too. So it works both ways, both laterally and, up and down in the organization. So I think if we can understand that, am I upset at this person because of something that happened 10 years ago, and I'm letting it impact how I make decisions today? Or is something really negative going on and I need to figure out how to handle that? So I think understanding how perception and unconscious bias affect how we make decisions and treat people is probably the biggest barrier that I would say. So not technology, more people.
Yeah, I think that was actually a perfect way to kind of close the episode in some senses. Your book is called Mind the Tech Gap, and you talked about those gaps, those perceptions. Kind of it's like mending fences. You've been working together for a long time. Maybe they did something at some point that you perceived a certain way, and it may not have even been intentional, or whatever the case is. It's kind of working through that, trying to understand each other, and try to mature together as a team. To drive those business outcomes. So I like how you close that up. I did want to ask our last question, of course. In terms of cyber resiliency, what does it mean to you in the context of operations and security?
Yeah, so I've been thinking a lot about this too, because we ask so many people, what does cyber resiliency mean to you? And hearing so many different perspectives on this. To me, cyber resiliency is about the integration of psychology and cybersecurity. It's about how we understand people, because if you can understand the people that you work with that are managing this technology, managing the infrastructure, it's only going to help build resiliency into those systems. And not just resiliency into the systems, but building resiliency into your teams. So how do you build resilient teams to go forward and work together? So I would say I would take it from a resiliency from a people perspective, which is, build resilient teams, work together, and build those relationships.
I like it. And I like it's kind of human-centered security, as we see like a push for human-centered design, human-centered security. So I like it. And as we said, the book is called Mind the Tech Gap. So everyone go out and check it out. I think everyone really enjoyed it, especially if you're working in large organizations with different teams of people. You're trying to work together and drive business outcomes. Definitely check it out. That said, thanks for everyone tuning in today, and have a great weekend.
Thanks, Chris.